Today, we're talking to speech language pathologist Adria Thompson about how speech therapists can support people living with dementia and how caregivers can learn to more effectively communicate with their loved one.
My name is Adria Thompson. I am a speech language pathologist and dementia educator. I own Be Like Care Consulting, and I create daily videos on social media to help professional and personal caregivers know how to provide really good care to individuals with dementia.
That's awesome. Can you share a little bit about your journey to becoming a speech language pathologist and how you started specializing in dementia care specifically?
Yeah, I definitely wasn't a person who knew what they wanted to do their whole lives. I was actually undeclared going into college, and I waited to the last week before you had to declare a major to do that. But I took a class called career counseling, and I did a lot of aptitude tests and personality tests and things like that. And it told you what avenue, what kind of job would be good for you. And speech language pathology popped up multiple times. I had to do a paper on one of the options for myself, and I chose that, not really, understanding what that meant. But then once I realized, oh, it's just speech therapy, I actually received speech therapy until 4th grade for articulation. So I couldn't say my R's and my S's and things like that. And so I had some personal experience knowing what that was like, and I was interested in education. And so I was just thinking, like, that would be a good fit. So all through undergrad and grad school, I thought I wanted to work with children. And specifically, I loved working with children with severe disabilities that were nonverbal, that needed augmentative and alternative communication devices. And I just really loved the challenge of working with people who maybe others had discounted or had felt like, they weren't, they couldn't do much. And I loved advocating for and finding those moments of success for individuals like that. And so coming out of grad school, I was wanting to get a job in the town that I graduated from, which we're pushing out, 40 speech therapists all at once. And so it was really competitive. And I ended up applying for and getting an offer from a job in a nursing home. And I thought, well, I'll do that for a little while. It was good money. And so I thought, well, I'll do this and see. And I loved it. And I found that it wasn't necessarily children that I was drawn to, it was that challenge. And so working with individuals with dementia, I got the same kind of feeling of feeling like that passion of helping people who other people had just discounted. And yeah, so about I've been a speech therapist for 9 years. About 3 years into being a speech therapist, my own grandmother was diagnosed with dementia, and so that really ramped up my passion and drive for specializing in that area. And I just did a lot of trainings, a lot of extra, um, continuing education courses about the area of dementia, and kind of became an expert in the facilities I was working in. And the therapy company that I worked for a couple years ago asked me to, and an occupational therapist I worked with, to create a dementia program to train other therapists in being comfortable with working with people with dementia. And so we spent 3 years just traveling and training across like 14 different states, a bunch of therapists. And then I moved to Washington State from Kentucky, and I had to quit that job, and I decided I could do this on my own, and that's kinda where Be Like Care was created.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing sort of this journey you've been on.
Mhm.
How has the transition been for you from working with other people to working for yourself and establishing Be Like Care? How's that been?
Yeah. Being in the medical field, especially during COVID, was really, challenging. It was intense, and I worked in memory care at that time, and, so there's just it's quite a bit different. I am now not necessarily working specifically with individuals with dementia. I am working with their caregivers. And so that's a big change too, is I really love working with people with dementia and providing those skilled services and one-on-one care. But there's challenges with being a Medicare approved provider and billing and all of that that's hard to do in a private practice. So haven't gone down that path quite yet. But it is definitely different, and I love being an influencer or whatever you wanna call it, being on social media in any capacity is never anything that was on my radar, and it's not in my comfort zone at all, but it is making a difference, and so I'm just gonna keep running after it.
Yeah, I love that. And I find that surprising. You're so confident talking to a camera. And that's, a lot of work, but the work you're doing is really important there.
Thanks.
You obviously have a lot of experience at this point. Um, in dementia care and obviously personal experience with your grandma. Can you talk a little bit about maybe more so for people that are like more recently diagnosed or caring for someone who's been recently diagnosed? What are some of the misconceptions or myths about dementia care that you've seen or experienced, and how can we debunk them or otherwise?
Yeah. I think in the medical community, dementia care is kinda seen as end of life care, and although it is deteriorating, it is a degenerative disease, and ultimately people will die. It's not a terminal condition in the sense that it's gonna happen soon. So many people, especially who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, can live for 20 years with that diagnosis. And so I think a lot of times we see, someone being diagnosed with dementia and it's kind of like, well, get your affairs in order and, you know, but they still have to live their life for years, and caregivers still have to walk alongside them for years, typically. And so, what the thing that's not happening in the medical community is providing caregivers with practical advice and tips and education and training to know what to do in the meantime. Like, how do we get dressed in the morning when they don't want to get dressed? Or, like, how do we take a shower when they said they already have? And so that's kind of the gap that I'm hoping to fill, is to help caregivers who are trying to do it on their own, who have no training. They didn't sign up for this, this is not at all anything that was on their radar. So I think that's a misconception in the medical community is once a dementia diagnosis is provided, then it's just, just a matter of time. And I think that there's a lot more life that still needs to be lived, a lot more joyous moments and hope that can still be had. And we need to make it a smoother process. And I think another myth is, that there's no point in being provided any care at that point. There's no if someone has been diagnosed with dementia, then why should they get therapy? Like, why should they see a therapist, a speech therapist, a physical therapist because they're not gonna get any better? And I hear that a lot as a therapist from families and also medical providers of like, "Well, they have dementia, so there's really nothing you can do." And although, of course, I'm not going to reverse or cure any kind of degenerative disease, but what I can do is maximize someone's abilities, keep them as, functional, maintain those skills for as long as possible. And there's a lot of service providers out there who can do that. But we just have to realize that, in the therapy world, there's the rehabilitation model, which is restoring abilities after an illness, disease, or condition. But then there's the habilitative model. And habilitation just says, we're not worried about what you could do before. We know that we can't turn back the clock, but what we can do is make you functional now, keep you safe, keep you independent as much as possible now. And so I think that's a huge misconception is that a lot of medical providers are useless after a diagnosis of dementia.
Yeah, that's super disheartening to hear. Like, well, there's can't get better, so might as well not
Mhm.
maintain. Thanks for distinguishing sort of those two rehab models. um I guess sort of in your line of work, you just talked about, if someone can have dementia for 20 years. Like, there's, this disease progresses and it's going to change over time. What are some of like the common communication challenges that people with dementia experience, and how does that change over the course of the disease?
Yeah. So at the beginning in the early stages of dementia, even though someone can speak, that doesn't mean that they can communicate well. And so what I mean by that is, a lot of times their voice isn't going to change, their clarity, the speech clarity or articulation abilities, that won't change typically with just a diagnosis of dementia. But what does happen at the beginning is some word finding issues. And so this would be more instead of voice, this would be more of a language component. And so that's where a lot of times people will get stuck. They'll do the oh the thing, right? And so they get stuck. Either they come up with a wrong word and they don't realize it, or they are doing that kind of process where they're thinking, pushing through. And so that is called anomia. Anomia is just word finding issues. And so that's something typically that we might see at the beginning stages of dementia. And a lot of people can compensate for it. They can kind of get around the word, they can describe it in a way that you understand what they're saying. And it can cause issues. It can cause a lot of frustration and anxiety in individuals with dementia. But often in the very early stages, they can compensate enough to kind of get their point across. Then once we move into the moderate stages of dementia, we see them not being able to compensate as well. And not only is communication as far as producing speech and that kind of language component start to be affected, but also their awareness becomes affected. And so this is what we're going to describe as a cognitive communication disorder. So being unaware of your deficits is called anosognosia. That means that you don't know what's wrong with you. Much less if you don't know what's wrong with you, you don't know that you need help, right? And so what happens here is when you're not aware of your own deficits, then you can't communicate your needs effectively. So in the moderate stages of dementia, we will see people not communicate that they're thirsty, that they're hungry, that they've gone to the bathroom, that they need to go to the bathroom. And so because they have that cognitive unawareness, then they can't communicate to others to get their needs met. And so it not only becomes obvious in those moments of, "Oh, what's that word? What's that word?" But also they just, like, lose awareness that they are having any trouble at all, and that can be difficult. And then in the most severe stages of dementia, we're gonna see loss of language and communication across the board. So sometimes people will still vocalize, so that might just be sounds, but also they might be able to have some, especially social interaction. So if you say hi, they can say hi. You can say, "How are you?" They say, "Good." Those things that are really, we've done a million times in our lives. Um, but also we'll start to see where they're talking in words, but the message is not there. There's no content, right? It's just nonsense. And so at that stage as caregivers, we just want to make sure that they feel heard and that we kind of mimic or mirror back the energy that they're giving. So if they're like really angry, they're like, then you're going to go, "Are you kidding me? What?" But if they're really happy, you're gonna reflect that too. "What? Are you kidding me? That's so great." And so, yeah, it definitely communication changes over the course of the progression of dementia. And as caregivers, because we know that they can't change, we have to be the ones to adapt.
Yeah, that's awesome. Any other tips for caregivers sort of as this progresses? Like, not really sure what my question is, but like, can people be looking out for signs? I'm sure it's like it's challenging for a caregiver also to be like experiencing changes every day is
Mhm.
different. Don't know what to expect yet. There's like an emotional component to this also. Just like any other wisdom for caregivers as their care recipient starts to experience these changes?
Yeah, I mean, that is a good question because that's the thing is like with dementia, you feel the second you feel like you have your head wrapped around where they are and you're providing them all the appropriate support and everything, then they change. It's like a moving target. And so I think the best advice when it comes to communication or really any struggle that that exists in caregiving is to just don't be afraid to fail. A lot of these skills and these tips and tricks and things, it's all about trial and error. And so a lot of times people come to me and say, "Mom is having difficulty with word finding. She can't think of the word she wants to say. So what do I do?" And, do I fill in the words for her? Do I give her time to think? And my answer is always, well, ask her. In the very early stages, we can ask people, "What do you want me to do in these moments?" And later they might not be able to answer that. And then that becomes, if you can't ask the person what they prefer, then you just try one thing and see how it works out. So you might try to fill in the words. How does that look like? Does that frustrate them? Does that make them feel relief? Do you see their shoulders kind of relax and they're like, "Oh, thank goodness someone's helping me." So we always just need to try something, but be aware, be like an investigator and look at what is the outcome. And that'll tell you if those things worked or not. So if I was given a percentage accuracy in the types of things that I have tried with individuals with dementia, I would be like 10% accurate, 1 out of 10 times I get it right. But it's still important those 9 out of 10 times that we tried to see this, that's not an effective tip.
I think that's encouraging, I'm sure, for people to hear that you as a professional still, have a 10% success rate in what you're trying when you're communicating with people living with dementia. I guess in addition to what you've just shared, are there any like tools or resources you can recommend to caregivers who want to improve their communication, like books or courses? Any suggestions?
Yeah. Well, I recommend most importantly for individualized and specific recommendations for the person you love to have a speech language pathologist consult with you. So, um, that is by and large my biggest recommendation because everyone is so different. And something that might work for Bob isn't necessarily going to work for Mary because they have different types of dementia, different stages of dementia. But also, even if someone has the exact same type, exact same stage, they're the same age, everything's exact on paper, they could still look so different. And so, getting a speech language pathologist is really the best way to make sure that you are providing the right level of support, especially when it comes to communication.
I think that it I don't know if this is true or not, you can debunk this for us, but I think there's an assumption that speech therapy can be costly. I think you hear the word therapy and just assume this is gonna cost a
Mhm.
lot of money. And we know that a lot of caregivers are, struggling or stressed by finances. Can you just talk a little bit about the cost of speech therapy and if there's, assistant programs or insurance, what goes into this?
Yeah. Many people who have dementia are over the age of 65. Not everybody, but the majority of people are. And so therefore many of these individuals in the United States have Medicare. And, based on the specific need, there's a lot of, like, behind the scenes insurance, like, qualifications, but in general, most insurances, including Medicare, will cover the cost of speech therapy services. Now, there are always limitations in the number of visits, the there are many different places you can go to get, speech therapy. So, for example, there is home health therapy. That is where a speech therapist can come into your home. That is covered by Medicare Part A, and the requirement here is that the person is considered homebound. And the definition of homebound is that it takes a considerable taxing effort for someone to leave their home. And that's not just physically, but cognitively. So if you have someone with dementia that can physically walk everywhere, but it takes a considerable taxing effort with your energy mentally to make sure that they don't wander when you go out. Like there's a lot of difficulty there. They can still qualify a lot of times. So they are considered homebound, and a doctor, a primary care physician, has requested speech therapy services in their home for a reason. So it has to be a change in status. That could simply be mom used to be able to tell me her needs and now she can't. Or I'm noticing more word finding issues at this point. We just have to have some kind of qualifier to say she was okay before, but now there's a problem. If those things moving through the referral through a primary care physician, those things can happen, then many times people qualify for home health services. That is covered 100% through Medicare Part A. So those services are essentially free in the home. There's also outpatient services that sometimes can look like going to a clinic, going to the local hospital, outpatient therapy, or sometimes some outpatient therapists can come to your home too, which that's a little confusing, but just know that that option is out there. That is covered by Medicare Part B. And usually there is a 20% co-insurance, so you have to pay 20% of the therapy cost, but often that is picked up if you have a supplemental insurance. So let's say a Blue Cross Blue Shield or something like that, they will often pick up the other 20%, making therapy free. So, like I said, they will always limit the number of visits that speech therapists can come, but typically, at least an evaluation um, can is covered by insurance. So, don't I wouldn't necessarily worry about figuring out the stipulations of that. Allow like you could call your insurance and just ask what your situation would be. But for majority of people over the age of 65, especially, speech therapy services are covered.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for your, like, knowledge in the
Mhm.
Medicare realm. It does get complicated.
Yeah.
You started to talk about, you need a referral from your PCP to speech therapy. Um, Caregivers are obviously playing an important role here in managing care. Can you talk a little bit about how caregivers can advocate or ensure that, you know, speech therapists are collaborating with the rest of the healthcare team? And, obviously you're doing this day in and day out. Like, can you share any examples of seeing this happen well in collaboration or where there's room for improvement?
Yeah. So yeah, the first thing if you want a speech therapist to be, come to your home or whatever to meet with the individual with dementia in your life to give you specific recommendations, the first thing you're going to do, yeah, is go to the primary care physician and communicate that request. We often think that doctors will know what's best and that they will, do the referrals. They will assume what you need. That's not always the case because not because they're not brilliant, not because they're not great at what they do, but they don't know your everyday life, right? You come into a doctor's office and they see quickly just very little of what's going on, in that moment. They don't know what you're dealing with at home. They don't know all of the communication difficulties. So it's okay to ask a doctor, "Hey, I've heard about speech therapy on this podcast, and I would love for my mom to receive some." The breakdown that happens sometimes is what I described earlier, where some medical professionals still don't understand the benefit of therapy for individuals with dementia. And so I live in a rural town, and I can tell you, I've seen it here, that doctors don't understand. And they'll say, well, she's not going to get any better. Her speech is not going to improve. So I don't think that's necessary. And it's okay to say, I understand and I respect what you're saying, but there's a model called habilitation that's going to keep them independent to maintain their skills. And I would prefer a speech therapist to come out and evaluate, and they be the ones to determine if their services are necessary or not. And that could feel really weird, and I think it's a generational thing sometimes, that my parents and grandparents don't question their doctors as often, right? They don't like advocate in those moments as much, but it is perfectly appropriate to ask for that. And you don't have to know all the specifics and everything, but asking is going to be the first line of defense. And so that will be a referral is necessary from a doctor for insurance to cover speech therapy services.
I think we need just like a sound bite of what you just said, and people can take that with them to to their doctor.
Yeah.
It can be hard to advocate in a doctor's office. Even I think generationally, I've experienced it myself. I'm like a fairly confident person, and I get in the doctor's office, and I'm
Yeah.
like, well, I'm nervous. Um, I guess if if a doctor like won't get on board with this or isn't interested in it, any advice for like finding a new doctor? Like, at what point how do you manage a care team that's, like, really looking out for the patient's best interest?
Yeah. I think that if finding another doctor is an option, often inside of a doctor's office, like, you will have multiple doctors that are there, maybe a PA, um, and so even if one like, the MD says no, like, or if a PA says no, then you can move up to an MD, and maybe they will say yes. So, that's kind of the line that exists there, um but it's always okay to ask, I would like a second opinion, to make an appointment somewhere else. But like I said, many times generationally, I'm seeing that a lot of like my grandparents are very loyal to their doctors. Like they've been there for years and years. And so that feels really uncomfortable for some. But it is, it's possible to get a new doctor and get the referrals you need, especially when it comes to with, like, getting a dementia diagnosis. Sometimes doctors are unwilling to give that diagnosis, and we know that getting a diagnosis is important, gives you access to certain resources, it gives you access to insurance reimbursement for services like therapy. If I don't have a diagnosis on a chart to provide speech therapy for, it's not gonna be covered. And if a doctor is saying, "No, I don't want to put a label on them of dementia, like, that can be problematic, so finding a doctor that aligns with what your needs are, is really important. So, just, go through your insurance, see who else are approved providers in your area, and make another appointment. It's not nobody's gonna get their feelings hurt. This is as a medical professional, it's not gonna hurt my feelings. Like, I will sleep at night just fine if a patient of mine goes to another speech therapist. Like, it might be a moment of reflection, but for a lot of physicians, like, it's not gonna hurt their feelings.
I think that's encouraging to hear. So we've talked about speech therapy, obviously. That's your expertise. But in your, experience, I'm wondering about what are other like critical pieces or key components of a dementia care program, and how can caregivers, like implement these or include them in sort of daily life?
Yeah. So, just like pretty much everything I just said about speech therapy is also true for physical and occupational therapy, as far as the referral process and the habilitation model. And so, I think it's really important for caregivers to understand that physical, occupational, and speech therapy services can be helpful to not only come in during emergencies like a fall or, a hip replacement or something, but also for prevention before those terrible things happen. If you are starting to notice a decline that's affecting their function, you can have an occupational therapist. Maybe I'll give a quick overview. An occupational therapist helps with activities of daily living. So that's like showering, toileting, dressing, self-feeding, all of those occupations. They help with safety. They help with fine motor skills. They can recommend adaptive equipment or pieces of like products or pieces of technology that can help caring for yourself or caring for someone else easier. Physical therapists are experts in movement, so they can help with assessment of like range of motion, strength, endurance of moving throughout their environment. They can recommend wheelchairs or walkers or rollators, the specific one that they need, and help you through the insurance process of getting it covered. Physical therapists also help with safety, they help with pain management. And speech therapists, we help with all areas of communication, cognition, and swallowing disorders. So, although I'm biased, I think therapists are the best part of a dementia care team and the most underutilized one as well.
Do you have any insight onto, I mean, I can make a guess, but why they're the most underutilized?
Yeah, it's that same myth, the belief that, well, they have dementia, we can't make them better. And for families and medical professionals to see therapists in the rehabilitation model, which is restoring. Tomorrow, my husband's getting a surgery done on his foot. He'll be non weight bearing for a few weeks. He'll have to do therapy, and he's doing the rehabilitation model. Before the surgery, he could run 3 miles. Then he has the surgery because he broke his foot. And then after that, the goal is for him to run 3 miles again. We want to get him back to what he was doing before. And that's not what we're doing with people with dementia. And so we just assume that it's not appropriate. We assume that therapy is not helpful. And that is so untrue. And one thing that I haven't mentioned, which is very unfortunate, is that there are sometimes therapists who don't understand this. And so sometimes I'll hear caregivers send me a message, or I've seen it with my own eyes of therapists evaluating someone with dementia and saying, well, they're not appropriate for therapy because they can't follow directions. They're not a good candidate for therapy. And I just sometimes scream, like, in my head of, like, that is a symptom of the disease they have. That is not just a behavior, that's not a choice that they're making. We still have to get care done for them, and I think therapists are the best people functionally to help caregivers figure out, yeah, they can't follow directions, but we still have to get them on the toilet. So how do we do that? And so often, just like we might encounter doctors who don't want us to give us that referral, we might also encounter therapists who don't see the benefit. And everybody specializes in different things. A physical therapist who is used to working with athletes and like recovering from sports injuries might not be the best fit for someone with dementia. So we just have to continuously advocate and find the medical professionals that are going to serve our loved ones best.
Is there anything that people can do that, like, are on board with this habilitation model? Like, how can we shift this sort of, perception of therapy as being, like, not worthwhile for dementia patients? How can we I don't know, what is there to be done by way of advocacy to change this sort of, narrative?
Well, what I'm doing is creating lots of content surrounding that topic for therapists, for other medical professionals, for families. But I think also, just families saying, like, I understand your kind of like we described before, I understand your stance on this, but I am passionate about believing like that an occupational therapist can help my mom. And so if you aren't going to be able to provide me this referral or you can't provide these services, like, thank you for your time. Do you have a referral for me for someone who might be able to help me better? Um, I think just continuous, like, on the small scale in your own life, just keep advocating, keep advocating. On the big scale, it's gonna take also a lot of education for insurance because a lot of insurances over the last 9 years I've been a speech therapist, the reimbursement rate for individuals with dementia is steadily declining. And so that's gonna take policy change. That's gonna take, White House kinda stuff. Like, we have to dementia's not going away, you know, anytime soon. And so we have to continue to provide the best care and be a voice. So, raising up people who are trying to be that voice, sharing my videos when it comes to things like that, that's advocacy. But then also in your own life, just don't stop.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I'm gonna put you on the spot a little bit, but, is there
Okay.
any policy that we can, like, be looking out for, that people can be supporting or writing their, you know, Congress people about? Um, I don't know if that's something you know off the top of your head.
Well, I think that my best recommendation is to follow Caring Across Generations. That they are a platform that are raising up advocacy in government and using celebrities also to raise awareness of caregivers being supported. And in doing so, that is also the medical professionals that can provide caregivers respite and education. So I highly recommend following on Instagram, Facebook, just Googling Caring Across Generations. And they are going to be a great resource to help you know what you could be doing in your own neck of the woods.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll be sure to link them to this episode also. We've mentioned a lot of things, there's a lot of moving parts in dementia care, speech therapy, occupational therapy, dealing with doctors, etc. Um, I know, we work with all the time caregivers who feel, overwhelmed, um, or even frustrated by this journey. Do you have any, like, advice for caregivers and how they can prioritize their own well-being while managing all of these moving pieces and, like, working tirelessly to advocate for their loved one? How can they care for themselves as well?
Mhm. The first thing I want to validate is yes, dementia sucks. Like, it does, it's hard, it's emotionally, mentally, physically so challenging to see someone you love change before your eyes. And to change a relationship that has existed for a long time change how you communicate, change how you interact, change the fact that they maybe once cared for you and now you're caring for them. It sucks. So we never want to minimize the fact that, like, well, just be happy and like you're doing great. I think sometimes we provide encouragement without realizing the fact that, like, we need to validate the fact that it's hard and it sucks. So that's my first thing I want to communicate. But secondly, I just I think the most loving thing you can do, the most compassionate thing you can do for someone you love with dementia is to learn more about the condition and understand them better through learning about the disease itself. Taking time to educate yourself, to put names to some of these experiences, like, instead of just believing that they're in denial or they refuse to believe they have dementia, hearing a medical term like anosognosia kind of like lifts that away, lifts that denial. They're just being ornery, to it wipes that away and says, oh, wait, they have a medical condition where their brain is dying and like they can't help it. So sometimes when we learn these these terms, we learn these concepts, we can take a step back and realize that this we don't have to take it personally, that this is not an attack on us or, disrespect for us as a caregiver. It's not that they're not thankful, it's that they're completely unaware. And so I encourage all caregivers to, as much as you can, learn about the disease. Now, I also am very acutely aware that when you're caring for someone with dementia all day, the last thing you want to do in your free time is to like do a 3-hour course about dementia. But that is why, for example, I've created videos that are anywhere from 30 to 90 seconds, one a day, learn something. And over time, your perspective will start to shift. And it is, like I said, educating yourself is the most loving thing you can do for the person that you care for. And also just have a sense of humor. The name of my company is Be Light Care for a couple reasons. I use the term light because I love that it reflects I want my passion to illuminate the topic of dementia, to bring a dark, kind of scary topic to light, but then also to bring some lightness about it, right? To like make it not so heavy, to decrease that burden, that weighty feeling that a dementia diagnosis can come. And I think that bringing levity, humor, and just a sense of like, this sucks, yes, but sometimes it's funny, or like sometimes, we have this new relationship we have is lighter than the one we had before. Finding those little bits of light, I think, are important.
Yeah, I love everything you just said. And thank you for starting that with, yeah, dementia does suck. Um, Becoming a caregiver for someone for any disease can suck in many ways. And thank you for sharing tips that are real and not just like, be happy, it's gonna be okay. Because even if that's true, it's helpful to hear like actual, you
Yeah.
know, self-care tips. You have talked a little bit about the content that you create, which is incredibly helpful. If people want to learn more from you, where can they find you online?
You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Be Light Care. BeLightCare. So just search Be Light Care on any of those platforms, and you'll see that I have hundreds of videos about caring for individuals with dementia, whether you're a professional caregiver or a personal caregiver. Things about, like, how to get them dressed, how to keep them hydrated, what you can do for your own brain health. All of those things exist there, and I have it broke down into categories so you can find exactly what you need. Um, and I also you can email me at info@belightcare.com. And then on my website, belightcare.com, you will see that I do caregiver consultations. So if someone wants to sit down with me for an hour on Zoom and just explain your situation, I can walk you through some potential tips and tricks that could help you.
Yeah, that's awesome. Again, we'll be sure to link you everywhere so people know where to find you and how to contact you. Thank you so much for sharing so much information from your own experience. Um, I think this will be really valuable to people.
Good. Well, I've had a lot of fun coming here. Thanks for having me.